like to call the work session of Monday, July 6th to order. Felica, would you call the roll, please?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Pons?
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Here.
Mr. Maslin?
Here.
First, I'd like to welcome our new members, Caleb Rogers and Pat Dent, to the dais. It's a pleasure to have you with us and looking forward to serving with you all. This is our first meeting back in council's chambers. As you in the audience can tell, we're a little spaced out today, and I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to ask our city manager and city attorney to sit at the department head tables just to allow for council to have some social physical distancing up here. But with that, Mr. Trivett, would you talk a little bit about the phase 3 and COVID and how that affects us here in Williamsburg and the municipal?
Sure. I think everyone at this point knows the governor moved the state of Virginia to phase 3 on July the 1st, and the city joined that effort with our city facilities going to phase 3 of our operating plan on July the 6th today. So far, it's gone very smoothly. A couple of things that we have done that have changed our operation just a little bit is we've implemented a check-in process at the entry points to all of our public buildings. And so you simply text a number, and then that notifies the department that you're going to see, and then they text you back when they're ready to see you. What that does for us is it limits the number of people in the building, it limits the number of people who are standing in a line, and gives us a little bit more safety for our employees and for the public. As I said, so far, it's gone pretty well. I think Vice Mayor Dent used it this morning, didn't have any trouble, so hopefully that'll continue to be a smooth process for people that need to come to City Hall. But I will say that our department heads and our staff are going to continue to do all that they can to solve problems over the phone and using the internet. Obviously, that's still the safest method. Anybody following the news knows this is still a very serious problem. Over the holiday weekend, we did see some increases in Hampton Roads numbers, including here in Williamsburg, so we're not out of the woods yet. And so it's important that our citizens continue to take this seriously and do what they can to help keep COVID-19 spread into a manageable condition.
Good. Thank you for that. And I'd just like to echo that sentiment. We have seen numbers increasing. Fortunately, hospitalizations haven't increased proportionally, and certainly the death rate is down. And so those are positive trends, but we're not out of the woods. Okay, so that takes us to item number 3 on the agenda. Council purview for Thursday's meeting, Mr. Trivett.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So we do have a fairly robust agenda for Thursday, but a lot of it has to do with the same item. There are 4 public hearings related to the Williamsburg Area Transit Authority's acquisition of property here in the city from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. As you all know, they're acquiring the property out on Route 60 to continue to be their service facility as well as their administration, and they will be doing some modifications to that, and we need to make some zoning changes to allow that to happen. We're also going to be considering a public hearing for James City County School System to add a couple of bicycle sheds on their property for James Blair Middle School, and then we have a resolution for a CDBG grant to provide regional assistance to small businesses due to COVID-19. The mayoral appointments to boards and commissions, and then our final item will be adding a new fee to the courthouse for security and electronic summonses, and that additional fee will be paid to the sheriff's office.
Okay, excellent. And just by way of a reminder, we do have a public hearing scheduled for July 14th, a special called meeting to discuss the monument that is in Bicentennial Park, and that meeting will be held here. Is that 2 o'clock?
It's at 2 o'clock, yes, sir.
Okay, so that takes us to item B, public comment. See anybody in the audience, so we'll move on to background presentations. Item A. Today we have Michael. I had it all ready for him, Giardino, with the Newport News Williamsburg Airport here to give a presentation. So welcome, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Congratulations, Vice Mayor.
Thank you.
Members of City Council, thank you for having me. I reach out periodically to the city manager and the county administrators regionally. I know you may all be interested in governance reform, which we could talk about after my presentation, but I try to keep the the manager and also the county administrators up to date on what's going on. And when the manager extended an invitation to come to speak to you, I jumped at the chance. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I do have some slides that I've provided their paper for you in front of you. I want to skip all the way to the last slide, if you would, please.
Thank you.
I want to thank you because since my arrival in 2017, this community has been nothing but supportive of our efforts. And of course, we were hopeful to get a member on the commission, and we still are soon. But whenever I call, whenever I ask, whenever I write for reasons of support, which is what we need support. We have a great airport, but what we need is to get that word out nationally, and we're doing our very best. Actually, we were on CNN last week, so we're getting there, and it's all good news that I will report to you in the other slides that I have. But first and foremost, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to this community, the city of Williamsburg, to your staff, to you for the opportunity. If you didn't know, previous to this, we had certain engagements legislatively that I'll get into that required people step up and write letters and support us on a national level. And so my gratitude. So I'm going to roll through these pretty quickly and have time for questions. But primarily wanted to, we'll skip ahead to the third slide. There's a number 3 in the lower right-hand corner. And I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time on this since my predecessor is going to be sentenced on July 15th, but convicted on 23 felony counts. There was a lot of mismanagement going on. So, but, these things can be overcome, and we did. Primarily had to do with finance in many areas that were just broken and needed to be fixed. So this is not even dealing with airlines, except for the rates and charges, which is the first bullet there, which means we weren't charging enough to the airlines for just being at the airport. So I raised rates, or the commission raised rates in 2018 and 19, and without COVID, we were going to do it again this year. But of course, we froze them. So anyway, and then as the last bullet says, we had a lot of legal costs that we don't have anymore. So on slide 4 is some good news, though, that it doesn't look like great news, but we leak a lot of passengers, which means we have a lot of demand. So when that number says 24 passengers daily each way, that's 2,400 passengers that are going to 6 different airports, to include the Washington, D.C. airports and Raleigh-Durham. So we leak we leak now primarily to Richmond. It used to be the other way around, it used to be Norfolk. But now we leak more passengers to Richmond than we do to Norfolk. So that tells you something about the peninsula. Of course, the People Express deal, the Elite deal, which was a bad deal. And so it's made my job difficult in recruiting airlines. But things have been positive since. So, but on slide number 5, you'll see there is a bright side to it. We generate more trips per capita. We really do. We've done the analysis. The yields, and the numbers there, the 20.2, 18.1, and 16.7, those are cents. So that's how many cents per mile, per air seat mile that we generate in revenue. And as you can see, 20.2 is larger than 18.1 and 16.7. So we actually generate more revenue per seat than our competitors. Richmond and Norfolk. We have high load factors. That 80% means that 80% of the airplane is full most of the time, or better, usually better than that. And now during COVID, we're seeing that actually. Cost per employment, that is the cost to the airline that it per passenger that they put on an aircraft at our airport. And that's relatively low at $5.68. At my former airport, that number was near $14 per passenger. And in some airports, it could be $30 per passenger. a cost per employment. So you can see our cost per employment is very low at our airport, which we are a good value to the airlines. So lately, our talks with airlines have been very good. They weren't very good when I arrived, but over the course of 2.5 years, they've gotten better. And we actually had service that we were ready to announce, but unfortunately, COVID changed all that. And as I said earlier, the support from the community has been outstanding. So again, thank you, and thank the rest of the community. Anytime I ask for it, I get support. And SCASD stands for Small Community Air Service Development Grant. Okay, so that grant application that we submitted last year for nonstop service to Dulles on United Airlines, I had great support from the community. We were going to use the former RAISE funds from the Economic Development Authority, which still holds $1.2 million, by the way, in escrow. So those funds are still available. And that we were going to pair that up with about a $650,000 grant from the federal government. Unfortunately, the person in charge of the program was one of the key witnesses during the Spirito trial. So I don't think we were ever going to get the grant, but we submitted a fabulous package, and the support we had from the community was outstanding. So, and we're going to do it again. We're going to submit another package. We did an economic impact study. You can see the results there. This is during the down period. You know, remember, when AirTran was here, we had 600,000 employments. Now we have 200,000 employments every year. So this is with that 200,000 employment numbers. So the economic impact of an airport on a community is huge, and we can make it better. So let's talk about the pandemic, which are the next couple. So before COVID, we started the year doing very well. Of course, you know, we have limited service. We only have the Charlotte service and Philadelphia service with American, and before they left, we had 3 nonstops daily to Atlanta on Delta. But they were all performing very well, and you'll see in another slide I'm going to show you in a second. The numbers were good. The revenues were good, actually, for the fiscal year, July 1st, 2019 through this year. Things were going very well. We were running a $750,000 surplus. So revenues were good. Everything was going along swimmingly. The only challenge I think that we really had, besides the Cerrito stuff, because the news just doesn't help us nationally when we're trying to recruit. But the 737 MAX delay inventory, getting that into the system for all the airlines was troubling, because we were trying to announce new service, and that new service was based upon having enough airplanes and pilots to do that. So the 737 MAX delay, getting that investigation done and getting that airplane back in the air was hurting us, and it actually did impact the service that we were hopeful to announce before COVID. So on slide 8, here's the result of COVID, okay? Revenues dropped 99%, basically. The parking lot was empty. We didn't have any passengers, and we rely on car rental, parking primarily, those two. And the airline revenues aren't as high as they should be. And then, of course, our own restaurant. But really, car rental and parking pay for the airport. And we're self-sustaining. We don't ask for any help from the governing municipalities, which is a good thing, right? So, but revenues were down $500,000 a month. Okay, and what does that look like for passenger traffic on slide 9? You can see we've got 2018 and 19 there, and then we have 2020, which again was starting out very well. Those numbers are daily employment numbers or checkpoint numbers. So on that first day, 619 to the far left, that was how many passengers got on an airplane on that first day that we're counting. And day 1 there equals March 6th. So the 1, 2, 3, 4 along the bottom doesn't necessarily, that's not a calendar day, that's just a day, you know, that we have numbers for. So you can fast forward all the way to day 32, where we had 8 passengers. That was April 20th. So COVID, we saw it coming. You can see where people stopped flying for a little bit. Then I think everybody got back on the train and said, wait, I better get home. And that was around day 5. And then, the bottom dropped out around, I want to say the 11th or 12th or so of March. And, just never came back for us. Slowly creeping back. I stopped counting after that, April timeframe, because it really didn't matter, because we started to lose air service with the airlines, not necessarily passengers, but the airlines just canceled flights. So early on, and knowing what I know about certain things, I had my analysts, if you would look at slide 11, I wanted to look at, well, what's going to happen next? That's my job. Predict what are we going to do about it. So I looked at, I had our analysts look at a couple events, which September 11th was obvious. And then, of course, the Great Recession, which was then compounded by airline consolidation. Because if you didn't know, Northwest merged with Delta. Of course, here, Southwest merged with AirTran, or basically acquired them, and et cetera. So wanted to look at those things and then index them for our numbers, and just see what are we going to deal with for the next few years. So that's, you can see what that recovery trend looks like on slide 12. And then when you juxtapose the traffic at our airport on that, it'll be on slide 13. And then you can basically prognosticate what kind of recovery we would see. And you could see on slide 13 that a 9/11 recovery was a little bit longer to get back. A Great Recession recovery, I'm sorry, the 9/11 recovery was more rapid, and the Great Recession recovery was longer. I think we were like 33 months for 9/11 type recovery and almost 5 years for a Great Recession recovery. So it was going to take some time. So we knew we were dealing with something right off the bat. And this was, I want to say this was probably the 3rd week in March that we did this analysis, and it was clear to me that something needed to be done. Then when we looked at the numbers, when it came to, and I'm skipping over to slide 15, when you look at the numbers, and we ran some modeling very early on in March, and the bleed rate, I'll say, when we first forecast it, it was worse than, you'll please look at April, which is the center column, and the number that is in black font, 398,000. Well, before that 398,000, my first projections were well over 400,000. So we were going to lose 400,000. That number means we were losing $400,000 in cash every month. That was our bleed rate. And I know everybody else dealt with that, and I know you did at the municipality. So it was like, how do we stop the bleeding? Well, we weren't going to stop it, but how do we at least put a tourniquet on it and see what we can do later? And we did, and that had to do with 46 people, which was a hard decision to make. But it was a necessary decision. It would have been irresponsible to spend $400,000 a month and let it go out the door. No matter what the CARES Act said, no matter what anybody said, we just didn't have the passenger traffic, and you could see from the forecast that I just gave you, it wasn't going to get better fast. So we did what we could. We looked at other things like insurance. We didn't have as much activity, so we certainly didn't need to be insured. And other activities, utilities, not so much, because whether we had 1 passenger or 619 passengers, we still had to run a commercial air service airport. That was a mandate from the FAA. So, and this was all, by the way, this was all pre-CARES Act, because the CARES Act really didn't come through till about the first, second week of April. So that was our first prognostication. But as you can see on budget, the purple line versus the green line, we were going to end up okay. But you can also see that we could have ended up with $1 million in cash out the door forever, never get it back, no matter what. And again, I thought that would be irresponsible. As it is, it's going to be more like $750,000. Nothing I can do about it. We lost a lot of money in April. We lost less in May. We're going to lose fewer dollars in June. I don't have those numbers yet, but they're not going to be great, but they're not going to be awful either. And we're going to start the fiscal year off pretty well. So jump ahead real quick to Recovery Revisited. So, you know, after we looked at the bad news of April, May, and June, and we knew it was going to come, it's time to plan for July 1st, just like everybody else was. And I thought, well, if we get back to 50%, we're lucky. And knowing that, I chair a group of small airports all around the country, have about 100 people on a call every Wednesday, and everybody's suffering through the same thing. And we could see that, and I didn't even add in when the CARES Act was passed, and the airlines were allowed to consolidate in areas like ours, and Manchester, New Hampshire, and the Washington airports and the LA airports and San Francisco Bay Area. That hurt us because United and American could walk out the door, consolidate to Norfolk, and with absolutely no pain and still receive the federal subsidy. Delta took advantage of it. American did not. I'm very lucky that happened. But at the same time, we thought, well, we need to do something about the future. What are we going to do? So we froze rates. We've only programmed 35% of the flights. And I'm going to wrap it up. You can see the numbers here on slide 18, which you can see the enplanements for 2018. We didn't use 19 numbers. We used 18 just for comparison's sake. And then we put budgeted enplanements, and those are the numbers on top of those, I'll say bronze columns. So instead of having, 15,000 or so people get on an airplane every month, we're hoping for 6,297 for July, and so on. If we beat those numbers, which I think we can with the service that we have scheduled, we'll be okay. You can see the purple line's above the green line now instead of the green line being above the purple line, which means we're going to bleed about $150,000 in cash every month, okay? So we started out with a fund balance of $1.6 million in unrestricted cash. When I got to the airport, there was less than $300,000. So in 2.5 years, we built up an unrestricted fund balance, thankfully. And then the CARES Act money that we received is $4.1 million. We're actually going to end fiscal year 21 better than we started, based on this budget. Okay, so slide 19 says, we right-size the budget, it's flexible, it's sustainable. I do have my trustee, what I'm calling interim chief of staff. You're looking at the senior staff at the airport right now. Jennifer Spratley was our marketing public relations officer. She's qualified in many areas. She's doing business development now, again, running my staff, basically number 2 at the airport. You're looking at us. And grateful. She's working a new campaign where it's all based on cleanliness. It's based on, making people feel comfortable, wearing masks, being clean, sanitizing everything that we can possibly sanitizing, and doing it again to make people feel comfortable. I got a couple other pictures for you to look at. This graph here, you can just peruse it in your own time. On the left is 2019, on the right is 2020. So 2020, on the top graph is seats, and on the bottom graph are total flights. So you can see that we do have a schedule, it's written. It averages about 3 Charlottes and 2 Philadelphias per day. And it gets better in August and better in September. If we can fill those aircraft to 80%, we're going to beat that 35% budget number, and we hope it's 50%. So we had 210,000 enplanements last year in 2019, which was a good year. Wasn't a great year, but it was better than 2018. If we can make 50% of 2019, we'll be in good shape. Again, no help from the governing municipalities. We are self-sustaining. We have money in the bank. We're going to have more money in the bank at the end of the fiscal year than we had at the beginning. So and again, governance reform, it's a political process. It's really, I'm apolitical, and I don't get to pick my bosses, but I'm hopeful that the commission will expand. And again, as the process goes through, I look forward to keeping you all up to date, and I really thank you for the time and opportunity to speak to you.
Well, thank you for coming in. I'm sure some of my colleagues may have some questions, so I'll turn to the Vice Mayor if you had any questions or comments.
Mr. Giardino, appreciate the presentation and the update. I know it's been a difficult task to overcome all of the media coverage with the past issues, so I commend you for making that effort to overcome that reputation associated with the airport. And I think one of the things for me is we all realize what impact that COVID's had on the economy. But when you really look at the data, it really drives that point home of what a severe impact it's had on the economy, and especially at the airport as well. So it looks like, you know, you're managing the things, had to make some difficult decisions, and appreciate that. And in the effort moving forward, that it appears everything's realistic based on some realistic projections for overcoming COVID. So appreciate all the work that's being done.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Two questions. First one, can you talk a little bit about cargo as a profit center, and are there opportunities with, you know, Amazon building 2 major distribution centers in Hampton Roads?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Cargo is important, especially nowadays. I think we've learned it even more through COVID. Right before this process, I was ready to issue a request for proposal to put in at least 4 acres of ramp over on the east side, and also to put in a 50,000 square foot expandable to 100,000 square foot sorting center with dock space. It is in our passenger facility charge application with the FAA. That's that $4.50 that we charge on. We would like to use that money to develop for cargo. We have had conversations with private development, and we've also had conversations with Amazon Air. Not interested at the moment, but we have our contacts at Amazon Air. So we think it's an important thing, and we'd like to invest in it. Yes, sir.
Second question, can you talk a little bit about the federal partners in terms of what's going on with Air Traffic Control Tower and TSA, and how they're helping you, or maybe not so much?
It's a great relationship here. The tower manager was here for 13 years. He just got a job up in DC, so he's left. But it's a great staff. You may have seen things in the paper about the tower not being open certain hours. It's not open. It wasn't open certain hours to begin with, and then they further contracted their hours just because there was no traffic. So it didn't make sense to staff the tower. And the tower is a great thing to have, but there are many untowered commercial service airports throughout the country. What the tower does is it allows pilots to use instrument approaches and departures if there was no one in the tower, they might have to wait if it were a foggy day or the weather conditions didn't lend itself to the instrument. We're open all the time, 24/7, whether there's someone in the tower or not, and airplanes are coming and going whether there's somebody in the tower. But the relationship we have is outstanding. Same with TSA, outstanding relationship. They staff both Norfolk and us out of the same office, and we haven't seen any glitches. We have a better checkpoint because it's far faster and much more convenient, and you don't need to take nearly as amount of steps that you take in Norfolk or Richmond to get on an airplane at PHF.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation, and I also have a few questions. First of all, I used to fly frequently out of PHF back in the 70s. I used to fly United to Chicago and all over. It was and still is a great airport, and I took flying lessons down there too, so well familiar with it. You mentioned a leak in passengers, and particularly to Richmond, and I fit that category. When I look at airfares, Richmond tends to be lower for leisure traffic. And I remember at one presentation you were talking about, or the point was made that you all are really focusing on business and commercial traffic. And so can you speak to your marketing plan of how you plan on bringing back the commercial traffic, and if there are any plans to try to increase the leisure traffic as well?
The answer to your last question is absolutely yes, because it gets misconstrued, because I do say I'm going to focus on the 4 majors, to include Southwest, by the way. And I've said that, I said that here, and I said that at my former airport. I'm going to concentrate on the big 4 because that's where the revenue is, and that's where the passengers are, and that is also where the passenger is most satisfied. Because my experience with the ultra low costs has been they can make you happy with their fare, but they can also disappoint you. We were just talking about that this morning when they don't fly and their next flight is 4 days from now. So, and I've dealt with Allegiant, fine. Spirit is, we're on good terms with Spirit. Frontier used to be at PHF. So the answer is yes, we will recruit all of those because they do keep airfares low. And then with the other stuff, we know that we're a business airport. And I know all the history of this airport, but we are a business airport. And the airfares reflect that. I think we may have talked earlier at some point in time over the last couple of years about the General Service Agency fares, the GSA fares for government employees. And there is a huge disparity in flying out of PHF than there is out of Richmond and Norfolk. And it's so wrong. And it's the way they do the data. But, and we're working on that issue. But it's incremental with the airlines. You establish relationships. They get to know you, and they don't tell you when they're coming. They don't tell you when they're leaving either, but they don't tell you when they're coming. But as long as we have a good, solid, compelling argument for a city pair, which is very difficult right now because I don't have the data anymore because all the AirTran data is expired. Like New York market, Boston market, Pittsburgh market, all of that is expired. So I don't have the passengers daily each way to show on paper to the airlines because that's the traffic that leaks. Everybody's got to connect through Charlotte, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. But we have other sources of data that we look at to include Facebook. Like, where's your Facebook friends? And we compile all of that, all the goodness that I get from the community and bring it to the table with the airlines and say, you can really make a difference here and you will make a difference in your profit margins because we are a good value. So all of that comes into play. And I think over the last couple of years, we've built up better relationships with the airlines. If not anything that's happened, you know, in spite of everything. And again, July 15th is just around the corner. And it's going to be in the paper. But hopefully we can turn that corner finally and just get on with it. And the recruitment process will be much easier than it has been. Thank you for your questions.
And I know that Delta left. Is there sort of a timeline when they might come back, or is this completely up to their choice, or is it tied in some way to the government's sort of category of COVID-19?
It was all allowed in the CARES Act. There was a show cause order where we were allowed, and thank you again, all of you. Thank you again for your support. We had ultimate congressional support, both senators, you know, every member of House of Representatives. The governor's office even wrote a letter, as well as the municipalities, and said, you know, don't allow this to happen. But US DOT, who wrote that portion of the CARES Act, allowed some communities to be consolidated in one airport. And of course, we knew where that would be. It wouldn't be at our place, it would be at the other place. So Delta did leave, but they left their equipment, they left their station manager, they asked us if they could paint the other day, and I'm hopeful because we have very strong numbers. Those Atlanta flights were very, very good. And we could have supported a Detroit, for example, and a few others in their network. We could certainly do a Boston and New York after we stimulate it and get it going. So Delta could be a strong player. And again, we were just on the cusp of announcing another airline when COVID hit. So I'm hopeful, but back to the CARES Act. 30 September is a key date for the airlines. They can leave any community, and that's when the timeline ends where they could actually leave anyone. There are small airports out there right now that aren't like us because they were allowed to leave right away at our place, but they were mandated to stay, and they're not mandated to stay after September 30th, so all bets are off after that. So we're all just waiting around, and as part of that larger group, I'm kind of advocating for some of those small airports on a national level because as I said on CNN just last week, We don't want to see any air service deserts anywhere
Right.
in the country. So, but it may happen. The airlines are still bleeding cash, and they need to stop that bleeding as well. So you can expect, stations to shut down after September 30th. But, American stayed and Delta left their stuff. So let's hope for.
And on one of the slides, you had a number of 70 for the number of passengers for, I guess, one of those days. Do you have any idea of what number of passengers you're seeing now?
Yes, anywhere from 150 to 180. So, and that's with fewer flights, by the way. So the numbers reflected there, scheduled service was almost normal at that time. They were preemptively canceling, but it was normal. So anywhere from 8 to 10 flights a day were on the schedule. In June, we only had 3 flights a day, each to Charlotte. And yet we were still going 180 strong some days. So we're filling airplanes. So, good news.
And Mr. Maslin asked about cargo, and you mentioned about a cargo ramp, but you all do a significant amount of cargo, even with, do you not, or?
Significant, no. I wish it was better. But as much as they can get in the bellies of airplanes, and we can handle any aircraft in the fleet. So that, there's talk or rumor about, our runways are too short, or no. We have two runways, not one. We have plenty of ramp space. We take Air Force One all the time.
Yeah, I've seen
We've had
it
an
do touch and
Antonov, which
goes.
is one of the largest airplanes in the world. So we're doing fine. It's a great airport.
Yeah, it is. I really enjoy it. And one last comment. I think Mr. Maslin and I were both on a talk that the Business Council did with Secretary of Finance Lane, and he was talking about PHF and is well familiar with everything that's going on there, and was just talking about the need to recreate and think out of the box. And I think that's what you all are trying to do to help bring that traffic back. So
We are.
Thank you very much.
Finding Jennifer Spratley in the community a year ago was one of the best things that ever happened. We thought we were moving in a great direction, and then COVID hit, but I'll tell you what, can't be a better person to be in the office with to manage the crisis, and then the messaging and her thoughts and the marketing will be robust. It'll cost some money, but it'll be robust, and we look forward to it. Secretary Lane has been a great supporter of the airport.
Good. And please be sure and let us know what else we can do besides just advocate for the airport.
Thank you.
Why?
Why?
Well, thank you all both, Ms. Stradley and Director Giardino, for coming today and presenting in front of us. I had 2 questions, one on economic impact and the other on public safety. For the impact question, I was doing some research in the last few days and really enjoyed your resource tab on the website, talking about Hampton and Newport News and Williamsburg and areas in the region where people can go. And you had that interesting figure of $160 million in economic impact to Newport News, and then I think 185 in the entire Commonwealth. Are there any numbers around the peninsula and maybe from your area to Richmond and this broader region?
I will check and see. That study was done in the fall, and I will look at the data that was provided, and I'll see exactly where the zip codes were per se, and see, and I will get back to you about that.
It'd be fascinating to find out.
Absolutely.
My second question on public safety is, as the nature of travel is changing a lot these days, and especially in the last few months, we're seeing, and I'm reading reports of people who are considering both where they travel and how they travel based on how these areas are considering public safety, social distancing, cleanliness. So what are some of the broad stroke ideas you all have to maintain the safety of PHF? And also, just to follow up on that, and to make sure people know that you are considering that a priority.
Right. Safety and security is number one with us, and to include a safe place to work. So, and I'm very proud to say that we have a great public safety department, and my police chief, my fire chief, and their staffs are great people. We don't talk about security too much in the airport business, but what I will say is we look at every technology that we possibly can and use everything available to include facial recognition, but actually just the fact that we have such a strong public safety department, our relationships with law enforcement on either the local level, state level, and of course the national level. And so many law enforcement agencies circulate through the airport and have interest in doing so, and we partner well with all of them. So I think what we try to do is remind the traveling public that what we're doing. We don't talk again too much about it, and we're active with everybody that we can. The TSA has a fabulous network of intelligence that we receive if necessary. And again, I just think the relationships altogether, the fact that we work hand in hand, because the airport can't do it alone. Our staff is very small. So we need those relationships with, whether it's law enforcement or a incident on the runway. We can't do everything alone. We just need help. But it is a place where we concentrate on those things that you would want to concentrate on to make sure that we know where the good guys are and the bad guys are, and take the necessary precautions.
Specifically to COVID-19 being an avenue for public safety, how are you all planning to shift some strategy to make sure that people know that flying in or out of PHF is still a safe thing to do?
But number one, it was one of the things that recruited me to the place. It's one of the cleanest airports in the country to begin with, and the staff does a fabulous job. But we're highlighting it even further, whatever that means, making sure that people have visible cues, like hand sanitizers wherever you can look, or markers on the floor to keep your distance if that's what you choose to do. The airlines have put up plexiglass, so has the TSA and the rental car businesses. Wearing these, whether they're required or not, if people are mandated by the airlines, we should respect the people and make them feel comfortable that we're also participating. And again, we clean again, and we just say that. And Jennifer, a new ad on the radio, I hope you've heard it, which says we're clean. And I want to make you feel comfortable when you fly, because we understand your concern. People get nervous about flying anyway without COVID. So anything that we can do to make people feel comfortable with the experience. I want them to forget about the airport and think about where they're traveling to or traveling from, and not the airport and issues they had at the airport. I want them to forget about it, because that means it was just like brushing your teeth in the morning. You just did it, right? Or whatever. Just went to the airport and got on an airplane like I'm supposed to. So.
Well, it sounds like the reputation for a cleanly airport is strong, so thank you all for taking that so much to heart.
Well, thank you for coming. It does. I'm very pleased that with your financial management over the last year, you were able to put money in the bank to help you get through this unforeseen condition that you're in. I'd hate to think of where the airport would be if you weren't able to put $1 million aside for your operational expenses to help carry you through this challenging time. As I listen to you talk about the PPP loans and having to lay off employees, very tough decision, and it's not unlike what I hear locally with a lot of small businesses. Is even if you had people standing around, what would they do? Because there's no business. And that was very tough. And so I applaud you for having to make those tough decisions. I look forward to, getting all this behind us. If you can find us a vaccine, I think that would be helpful. Get people back in the airplane and get flying to their destinations. It sounds like you've got a lot of things under task. And I think working on stopping the leaking of 2,400 passengers a day will go a long way to make it even more successful. So thank you for coming in and giving us the time today.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to the citizens of Williamsburg. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that takes us to item B. I know we're all looking forward to the presentation on the legislative report from Ms. Shelton.
Good afternoon, Mayor and members of council. So every year I do a summary which is just to hit the highlights of what the General Assembly did. I'll give you the same caveat that I give you every year, which is that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. It's intended to alert council to things that council has the opportunity to do, or things that council is mandated to do, or things that are going to come before council at some point. This has been an extremely busy General Assembly session. We prepare a legislative update for the staff, and that was extremely thick this year. A lot of that's not in this summary because it's specific to departments. I'll give you an example. There were a number of provisions that are now required to be in residential leases that were found in multiple sections of the state code. And so I haven't included any of those types of things. So I'm just going to hit the highlights and try to get through this as quickly as I can. I'm going to start with employment law, which was a big topic this year at the General Assembly. So House Bill 1049 adds sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected classes for purposes of employment. It specifically applies to localities, constitutional officers, and school boards, in addition to other employers, but those are particularly called out in the bill. I would note that gender disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation has also been added to the list of protected classes for purposes of defining a hate crime this year. So they've gone through the Code of Virginia, and everywhere in the Code of Virginia that it lists protected classes, they've added sexual orientation and gender identity. That's with respect to employment, fair housing, housing protection, banking, and all the other places in the Code of Virginia where it lists classes of individuals that you are not permitted to discriminate against. It also prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in procurement policies. And so for the city, with respect to this, we're going to need to update the personnel manual, the grievance procedure, and the procurement policies to include these changes. There's also House Bill 827, which requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for the limitations of a person related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions if that accommodation is necessary to enable that person to perform their job, unless the employer can demonstrate that the accommodation would impose an undue hardship. It prohibits taking adverse employment action against an employee who requests that accommodation, or for denying employment or promotional opportunities if the applicant is qualified because they're going to require reasonable accommodation. It creates a cause of action against an employer who denies any of the rights that the bill provides, and damages or compensatory damages, back pay, or other equitable relief. And for both House Bill 149 and House Bill 827, you can file those claims in state court instead of in federal court. So when you have an employment claim, typically what happens is you're required to file an administrative complaint with either the EEOC or the Department of Human Rights. They investigate it, they decide whether or not they're going to pursue it, and if they choose to pursue it, then they act in the position of the plaintiff. And if they decide not to pursue it, they give the plaintiff the ability to then file their own action. This is important because state court is faster, and it's cheaper, and it's much easier to file in, and you can file in both general district court and in circuit court. House Bill 395 increases minimum wage in Virginia, and it does that incrementally. So it goes up to $9.50 an hour effective May 1st, 2021, and this was delayed. It should have been January 1st, 2021, but because of COVID-19, it was pushed back to May 1st. It goes up to $11 an hour in 2022, $12 an hour in 2023. The General Assembly then has to reenact increases that are planned for 2025 and 2026 prior to July 1st of 2024. Lots of dates, but effectively sort of halfway through, the General Assembly has to say, we want to continue to proceed through this. And if they do, then it goes up to $13.50 in 2025, $15 an hour in 2026, and then in 2027, and thereafter, it's adjusted according to CIP. There are some exceptions. There's a training wage of 75%. There's an exception for temporary foreign workers, for au pair programs and organized camps, or religious or nonprofit educational conference centers. None of which really apply to the city organization. House Bill 438 adds post-traumatic stress disorder incurred by law enforcement officers or firefighters as a compensable illness under the Workers' Compensation Act. So in order for someone to qualify for that, a mental health professional has to find that they're suffering from PTSD, and the qualifying event has to have occurred in the line of duty on or after July 1st of 2020. The bill defines what a qualifying event is, so it's either serious bodily injury or death to any person or persons, or an incident involving a minor who's been injured, abused, or exploited, or involving an immediate threat to the life of the person who's claiming workers' comp, or mass casualties, or responding to crime scenes. So PTSD from responding over and over and over again to crime scenes. House Bill 582 is one that started out as a requirement, and as it went through the General Assembly, it became an optional bill. So it authorizes, but does not require localities to adopt an ordinance that allows the locality to then recognize a labor union or an employee association as a bargaining agent that excludes constitutional officers but specifically includes school boards, and to then collectively bargain with that entity. Now, this doesn't become effective until May 1st of 2020. City Council can, at its option, decide that it wants to pass such an ordinance. But if City Council does not consider such an ordinance, then if a professional organization or union decides that they would like the city to consider that, they can make that request. And once they make that request, the city has 120 days after receiving the certification that they would like to collectively bargain to make that decision. So essentially, they can force City Council to make the decision if Council has not already done so. The bill does prohibit public employees from striking. A bargaining unit is not necessarily all city employees, but it's city employees who have common interests. So, for example, the police department could be a bargaining unit, or the fire department could be a bargaining unit. Those are the two obvious ones. The administrative staff in the municipal building could be a bargaining unit. They just have to have similar interests in their employment relationship with the city.
Again, to that, we don't have to do anything.
You do not have to do anything. And if you do receive a certification saying that a majority of the employees in the unit would like to collectively bargain, you have 120 days. The law does not require you to agree to collectively bargain, but it does require you to consider the matter and vote on whether or not you would like to do that. This, by the way, does not apply to state employees. This is just local employees and school employees. There is no doubt that there will be additional legislation on this next year. The sponsor of the bill has said they're going to bring more legislation back next year. So before we get to May the 1st, there may be some changes to this. House Bill 757 prohibits employers from asking questions regarding arrests, charges, and convictions on applications. So this is essentially ban-the-box legislation. The first inquiry that an employer can make is either during or after an interview of the prospective employee. There are exceptions, so law enforcement agencies can ask the question on their application or positions which are deemed sensitive. So, for example, departments of social services have positions for which you can't have certain convictions in order to fulfill the obligations of that job. And so those would apply in that circumstance. It does not apply to positions for employment by the school board. So again, like social services, teachers, very sensitive with respect to certain crimes pertaining to children. House Bill 783 adds cancers of the colon, brain, and testes to the list of cancers that are presumed to be occupational diseases for firefighters covered by the Workers' Compensation Act. It does not apply to diagnoses made prior to July 1st of 2020. So that's the beginning date, and if it's a diagnosis that happened prior to July, these would not be covered. It also reduces the number of years of service to qualify for various types of cancer from 12 to 5. And for hypertension and heart disease, it adds a requirement that the individual has completed 5 years of service in their position to qualify for that. House Bill 1407 prohibits an employer from misclassifying an individual as an independent contractor if he is in fact an employee. So the IRS guidelines have a test for determining that. And the biggest part of the test is the amount of independent judgment that that person uses in doing their job. So for example, I need a widget, and I contract for someone to produce widgets for me, and I send that person off to produce widgets, and I don't tell that person how they have to go about producing widgets, versus the person is in the office and I'm instructing them how they need to produce the widgets in a certain way to satisfy my requirements as an employer. So that's a really oversimplified explanation of the amount of direction and control, but that's the type of rules that the IRS promulgates. We have to abide by those anyway because we're required under FLSA to correctly classify our employees. And so there are much bigger penalties for us if we misclassify employees as independent contractors. This now makes it universal to employers. The city obviously is an employer, so here's an additional penalty if we get it wrong. Violators are subject to civil penalties, and those range from $1,000 to $5,000. And if they're an entity that contracts with public entities like the state government or local governments, they can be debarred from participating in public contracts. So that has the potential to catch up with us on our procurement as well. And the bill is effective on January 1st of next year. House Bill 798 is a whistleblower bill that prohibits the employer from discharging or taking any kind of employment action against an employee because they report a violation of state or federal law to a supervisor, to law enforcement, or a governmental body, or you ask them to violate the law and they refuse to do that, or because they participated in an investigation, or because they testify regarding an alleged violation of federal or state law or regulation. So this is more than, I don't think that what my supervisor told me to do is very ethical, versus I think what my supervisor told me to do is against the law. If it's the latter, then the refusal to do whatever your supervisor has told you to do then triggers this provision, and it creates a civil cause of action. So if you've been fired, you can be reinstated, and the penalties are compensation for lost wages and benefits and any other remuneration like bonuses that you may have been entitled to. Okay, so that's the big 30,000 feet explanation of employment law. I'm going to move on to law enforcement. As you know, because it was in the press a lot, there were a lot of firearms bills that were considered by the General Assembly, and a number of them have become law, and I've given you a list of a few of them, but that's not intended to be an exhaustive list because all of these are issues of state law, right? They're going to go into effect, and the city's not making a decision point with respect to them. The one for which the city has a decision point is House Bill 421, which authorizes localities by ordinance to prohibit the possession or carrying of firearms, ammunitions, or components in any building owned by the city for governmental purposes, in public parks owned by the locality and recreation centers or community centers, or in a public street, road, or alleyway or sidewalk when there's an event permit that is in effect for that time. So very much part of what we do on a regular basis on Duke of Gloucester Street. The law does not require council to do any of this, but this is a change because prior to this, 15.2, 915 of the Code of Virginia prohibited the locality from adopting any regulations, and that language is still there, but this is one exception to that. The bill also allows firearms received in a buyback program, should the locality have a buyback program, to be destroyed Prior to the change in the law, they could only be sold. Unless the person who's surrendering the firearm to the police department requests in writing that it be sold, then the locality has to attempt to sell it before it can otherwise dispose of the firearm. And there are some exclusions to this for ROTC and athletic events, sponsored college athletic events that are sponsored utilizing firearms as long as the institution is supervising.
And this is regardless of concealed weapon permits and...
It doesn't affect, yes, this is a ban on concealed weapons or open carry should City Council decide that they wanted to impose that. And currently the law, well, prior to last Wednesday, the law allowed localities to require employees to keep guns locked in their car, but not bring them into buildings. And so this would, if council were to choose to do that, it would be consistent with what the city already does with its own employees. House Bill 1427 authorizes a private vendor operating a school bus video monitoring system for a school division to impose and collect an administrative fee. So last year, council authorized cameras on school buses and a civil fine for passing a school bus illegally. This is an additional fee that the monitoring company can charge for the cost of processing the paperwork for the civil penalty. And it's a graduated thing. So if they send a summons, a notice and a summons to the person who illegally passed a school bus, less than 30 days, that person then pays the summons and notice. There's no administrative fee. If it's less than 60 days, the administrative fee can't exceed $25. If it's more than 60 days, the administrative fee can be whatever the reasonable cost of collecting the fee is to take the case to court. The locality has to authorize the additional fee, and so given that that City Council last year authorized this, I suspect that the school board will probably come back and ask City Council to implement this as well to pay for the cost of the program. Also, House Bill 1442 authorizes law enforcement agencies to operate photo speed monitoring devices in and around school crossing zones and work zones for recording vehicles that are exceeding the speed limit by 10 miles an hour. Council can authorize this, and the zone then must be conspicuously signed that the devices are being used in the area. House Bill 972 decriminalizes marijuana possession of less than an ounce and makes it a civil penalty that has a fine of not more than $25. So the summons is issued in the same way that a traffic summons is issued. The summons is not supposed to appear in someone's criminal history record information. So when you run someone on BSIN or NCIC, it's not supposed to show up. If it does show up, it cannot be disclosed. It's not available for public disclosure and inspection. Employers are not allowed to ask someone about their history of possession of less than an ounce of marijuana, and it directs that a work group be convened and report regarding the legalization of marijuana. So this is one step in the process. House Bill 742 authorizes localities by ordinance to regulate the takeoff or landing of drones from property owned by the locality. That has to be done in accordance with rules and regulations that don't currently exist, developed by the Department of Aviation. There are reporting requirements regarding whatever ordinance, if council decided to adopt an ordinance. All the local government attorneys that I'm aware of in Virginia have taken the position that council already has the authority to ban someone from using a drone or taking off on city property. If you wanted to allow that and have regulations regarding it, then those would need to be through whatever rules are developed by the Department of Aviation. They would have to be consistent with that. And they're supposed to develop those rules by January 1st of next year. House Bill 881 clarifies that skill game machines constitute illegal gambling. So City Council talked about this with our legislative delegation last year. However, due to COVID-19, the governor requested that the bill be delayed with its effective date to July 1st, 2021. And in the intervening period, so from July the 1st of this year to next year, they're allowed to exist, but they will be subject to a $1,200 a month tax on each game machine, and 12% of that tax is to be paid to the locality in which the machine is located. So that's going to be collected by the state and paid back to the locality.
These machines make that much money?
Apparently.
Wow.
House Bill 904 adds athletic coaches, directors, and other persons who are 18 years of age or older, who is either employed or volunteers with a public sports organization or team. They are now listed as mandated reporters for child abuse. Failing to report ranges from a $500 fine to a Class 1 misdemeanor. I've talked with Ms. Evans about making sure that our recreation department folks have had some training on this. House Bill 1071 removes the crime of profane swearing in public from the Code of Virginia. So that was part of the drunken public statute, and they've removed the language that makes it a crime to swear profanely. We have a similar provision in the city code, except it's not geared simply as profane swearing. It's engaging in abusive language that is likely to give rise to disruptive behavior or a breach of the peace, is how it's phrased in the city code. That is authorized by the Supreme Court, and so I don't think our ordinance is unconstitutional. I think everyone took the position that the provision in the Code of Virginia was unconstitutional. House Bill 1213 permits localities to appoint and train employees to enforce local ordinance by issuing summonses for misdemeanor violations of the city code or any code other than Title 18.2, which is the crimes code in the Code of Virginia, or traffic offenses. So this is a pretty useful tool because when we have, say, for example, a fire code violation, which is a criminal offense, or someone fails to pay their room and meals tax, one of our employees has to go down to the jail with an affidavit and swear in front of a magistrate that the information that they are providing is true and correct, and have the magistrate issue the summons. And so this code provision allows that to happen internally without having to go through the process of utilizing the magistrate. And so it would be helpful to have the employees who are responsible for enforcing the things that are still criminal offenses in the city code to have the ability to do this and are trained to do it. So we'll pursue how we obtain the appropriate training. House Bill 183 authorizes localities to remove monuments. So City Council discussed this at its last meeting, and we have a meeting on this next week. The locality is required to hold a public hearing after 30 days notice, and assuming that the locality then chooses to take an action with respect to the monument, then it has to be offered to a museum, a historical society, government, or a military battlefield for 30 days prior to whatever the action the council has authorized happening. House Bill 533 prohibits the dispensing of food in polystyrene food service containers beginning on July the 1st of 2023 for certain chain restaurants, and that's defined as restaurants that have 20 or more locations, and by all food vendors by July 1st of 2025. There's a $50 penalty, and either the Attorney General or the locality can bring the action to enforce the penalty. The penalties are either deposited in the litter control fund of the state or to the treasurer of the locality, depending on who's taking the enforcement action. The law directs DEQ to post public information regarding compliance and to provide a process for filing complaints. However, there is an exception. There is a process for the locality to provide one-year waivers to individual vendors based on undue hardship. So we're going to need to develop whatever that process looks like for City Council to grant those waivers. There's also an exception for nonprofit organizations that use these. House Bill 534 authorizes localities to impose a 5-cent tax on per bag on disposable plastic bags provided to consumers by retailers beginning on January 1st of 2021. So according to the bill, the retailer retains 2 cents of the tax, and in 2023, that's reduced to 1 cent. The tax is paid to the state in the same manner as state sales tax and then distributed to the locality imposing the tax. And I've listed for you the exceptions, so plastic wraps or bags to prevent contamination in garbage bags or reusable plastic bags are not included in the definition of disposable plastic bags in the ordinance, in the statute.
Just to be clear, like the bag you would get at the grocery store?
Yes. House Bill 785 grants counties the ability to impose certain taxes, including cigarette tax and admissions tax. So this has been very piecemeal in the Code of Virginia. Some counties have gone to the General Assembly and asked for the ability to impose these taxes. Other counties haven't. The tax rates are different depending on where you are. So this is a general authorization for counties to impose those taxes. There is an exception that counties that are receiving an additional 1 cent state sales tax for tourism product and tourism promotion are not allowed to raise admissions tax. It eliminates the rate of eliminates the limit on the rate of transient occupancy tax a county can impose. They can impose food and beverage taxes up to 6% and eliminates the referendum requirement before imposing the tax. The bill also caps cigarette tax for all localities, cities, and counties to 2 cents per cigarette, which is for a normal pack of cigarettes, 40 cents a pack, unless the rate was already higher as of January 1st, 2020, and in that case, it can't be raised beyond what it was in January 1st of 2020. And this bill becomes effective next year.
And the exception for communities that have like the historic triangle marketing tax is to protect Busch Gardens, essentially.
Well, so it's the 1 cent sales tax that the city is not entitled to impose an admissions tax. And so with this bill, York County and James City County have the same limitation. House Bill 1578 provides for a separate taxing classification for merchants' capital when that capital is inventory and it's located in a structure that has 200,000 square feet. When that 200,000 square feet is used solely to store the inventory. And then it authorizes a lower tax rate. That's a decision for the locality to make. We don't, in the city code, list out all of these different exceptions and impose different rates. The rate in the city is uniform, but they've added a new classification in the state code. House Bill 1655 provides a way of transferring tax delinquent properties in common areas of a subdivision with a homeowners association that's gone defunct. So we do have a few of those in the city. Whether Indian Springs ever had a homeowners association, I don't know, but there are some slivers of land all over the city in subdivisions that never got developed, and it's not clear who owns them. This process allows the property to be granted to the adjoining landowner. And this is in lieu of public auction. So all these little slivers that we have are not buildable. But this is a method to potentially get them back into the city's tax base. So right now, the taxes on them are not very much and they're not usable. And so it hasn't been worth the effort of going to court. There's no owners and it's difficult to track them down. So this has the potential to be a very useful process to clean up those types of things that I'm aware of exist in the city, which is why I included it in the slides. And the locality can waive any past taxes, penalty, and interest in order to facilitate that.
Does the adjoining landowner have a choice as to whether they want to?
Yes, they don't have to agree to do this. But it's one possibility for dealing with a little problem that's sort of hanging out there that we might be able to fix a few of these this way. House Bill 452 increases from $100,000 to $200,000 the small purchase exemption under the Virginia Public Procurement Act for single or term contracts for goods and services other than professional services. Right now, ours is sitting at $50,000. So if staff or council decides that they want to change the public procurement process in the city purchasing manual to increase that limit, it can go up to $200,000 now. So there are a few things that are specific to council that I wanted to mention. Senate Bill 57 requires that candidates for local and constitutional offices file their campaign finance reports electronically. I'm sure most already do, but this now makes it mandatory. Senate Bill 977 requires local bodies to hold an open forum for members of the public to speak, as opposed to a public hearing, but like our normal open forums, at least one time per quarter, so 4 times a year. Prior to now, there has not been a requirement that City Council hold an open forum, although you do at your meetings on a regular basis. Now you have to do it by law at least once a quarter. House Bill 1103, I don't know the history of this, and I wish that I did, allows for ranked choice voting in elections for local governing bodies. So the process in a nutshell would be that voters would vote for candidates in order of preference, and then you go through rounds where people are eliminated. So if there are 7 people on the ballot, you would rank those people 1 through 7 as your preference indicates, and then that score is weighted. The code is not particularly specific regarding what that process needs to look like. The State Board of Elections in the statute is charged with establishing those regulations for what that would look like and how it would work. And then the local governing body is required, if they decided to do that in consultation with the electoral board. It's not a requirement, it's just something that if you're interested in pursuing it, you can. The bill has a sunset date, so it goes into effect next year, and it has a sunset date 10 years later. So I think this is just an option to see if anyone's interested in doing this.
So essentially, you would have multiple elections getting into
Well,
a final?
No, it would be a one-time election, and people would be eliminated from the process, and I wish I could explain it. The code doesn't explain it very well, which is why the State Department of Elections is charged with figuring out how that would work. But it's clear from the statute that it's one election, and that everyone would vote for everyone in order of their preference.
Gotcha.
It appears that our charter would not prohibit this, so it would be something that would need to be established by ordinance. It wouldn't be a General Assembly session without more COIA bills. So the Conflict of Interest Act has been amended. Previously, in your disclosure forms, the clerk was required to redact addresses and personal telephone numbers. Now they're also required to redact your email addresses. And House Bill 1528, I do know the history of this. This comes from an unfortunate circumstance in town of Front Royal. And so now the executive director of the EDA and the members of the EDA are required to file a statement of economic interest with the clerk of the locality, both prior to assuming office and then annually, just like council on as of February 1st of each year. And then the bill clarifies that intentionally making a false statement on your statement of economic interest is a Class 5 felony. Additionally, House Bill 1527 requires the executive director of the EDA and each member of the EDA to take training on the Conflict of Interest Act and the Freedom of Information Act at least once every 2 years. So for this year, they have to complete that training prior to December the 1st, and then they have to complete it every 2 years thereafter. Just like with council, the conflict of interest training, you have to take the training from the Virginia Conflict of Interest Advisory Council, but FOIA can be either conducted by the FOIA Council or by the local government attorney. And the last slide, can't get past without saying anything about zoning. House Bill 726 increases the time that council has to approve or disapprove the comprehensive plan from 90 days to 150 days. I will say there were a lot of solar bills this year, but it was largely solar generating facilities and not really residential solar like we would have in the city of Williamsburg. And so I haven't included any of those because I don't think any of them will ultimately be applicable to the city. So,
Well, again, it's another comprehensive rundown of potential bills that we have to address. So traditionally, what we do, if there's something that we have to codify in the code of, in our own city code, you'll come forward, we'll have another meeting, and
I will, there's not much this time around that's mandatory. There's a lot of, city council has the right to do it, the discretion to do it, but is not mandated to do it. So you're not actually going to see a lot of housekeeping bills from us, at least not initially. There's some things that we're going to need to do with respect to, say, for example, the polystyrene containers. We'll need to develop what that looks like to grant a waiver, but we have a lot of time before that really becomes an issue.
so nothing jumps out at me, but I'll turn to members of council for other discussion or thoughts.
Ms. Shelton, I just appreciate, I know that's a lot of effort to bring us up to date on all of the bills that have been presented, and as the mayor mentioned, what we might have to take action on in the future. I did have one, just so I'm clear, one question on the previous employment slide early in your presentation. It talked about not asking about arrest charges and convictions on the application, but you could ask about them in an interview process. Mm-hmm. Can you ask about the marijuana in the interview process?
No. So the marijuana would be an exception to that if it's less than an ounce. So simple marijuana possession is no longer a criminal offense. And even though the Code of Virginia still refers to it that way, it's not. And so they do not want you to ask as an employer about simple marijuana possession and define that as less than an ounce.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Well, just to follow up on that, when you said that sensitive positions may allow for other types of questions, and
There isn't an exception, well, there are exceptions also for law enforcement with respect to the marijuana possession, but those are specifically articulated, and so I'll make sure that the department heads are aware, but we have I think we have one employment application, so that really then only becomes an issue in the interview process.
but in finance, we could ask if you've been convicted of embezzlement, couldn't we?
Yes, it's just related to the civil penalty of marijuana possession of less than an ounce.
Maslin?
Several questions. In terms of the employment issues and hiring, do we still, or what's our policy in terms of when we would do a credit check? Is that certain key positions like procurement?
Yeah, Mr. Maslin, I don't know that we do a credit check for any positions. We've not hired procurement since I've been with the city. So I don't know that that's a standard practice for us.
We do criminal background checks.
Right.
And those are
And driving checks as well.
Right, and those are done after an offer is made. The offer is conditional on those background checks coming back and being clear.
Right.
Yeah, and then continuing on employment law, does any of this change affect us when we're giving drug tests?
None of it affects us when we're giving drug tests. If someone comes back, and I think we're going to have to internally talk about what a positive drug test for marijuana is going to mean, right? So now it's no longer a criminal offense, and we haven't had that conversation, and marijuana stays in your system for 30 days. And so, at least that's my recollection. And so it's going to hang around for a little while, and you don't know when someone has smoked it or how much they've smoked or how regularly they smoke it. But I think we're certainly headed down the road of decriminalization and legality, making marijuana legal. And so do we want to do drug tests of employees for marijuana? And then if it's not an illegal substance, it's not really going to be a disqualifier potentially for employment. But that's a decision that we've got to have a lot more conversation about.
And it may be more on the employee safety side. In other words, if the employee is under the influence, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, right?
Well, I mean, we would treat that the same way. If somebody was at work and under the influence, that would be a disciplinary issue, regardless of the status of legality.
Right.
I don't think that us addressing our stance on how to handle a positive drug test because of somebody's recreational use at home, much like alcohol, would have any bearing on whether or not we think they can use the substance while at work. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think more after an accident, if you decide to have it.
Sure.
test.
Sure, I
Sure,
mean, that's
right, of course.
absolutely, but for.
The difficulty there is proving
And when they
when they
smoked
did it, because like she said, 30
Right.
days, and, you know, I've worked for localities where we had that exact issue. You know, we had at that locality, we had a drug disciplinary task force that reviewed all the cases associated with violations of the drug policy, and very frequently, that would be the issue, would be there was an accident involving a car, they fell down at work, and the requirement was you'd be tested. The test came back positive for marijuana. The employee, of course, said, well, that was days ago. So then what do you do to rectify that?
On the criminal law changes, is there anything that we'll be looking at in terms of our city ordinances that may need to mirror the changes?
Not that come to mind. You know, most criminal laws are state code provisions and not city code provisions. And so we have some city code provisions that are the same, but most of the time we're relying on the state code.
Yeah. In terms of the drone laws, it was a little confusing in terms of, it was just talking about property owned by the local jurisdiction. And typically, in terms of aviation, it's really the FAA and the federal laws prevail. And especially if we know that we're seeing more and more drone deliveries, either by libraries or, you know, FedEx, Amazon. This seems to be like a lot of patchwork.
Well, it is. Part of the reason is that several years ago, localities were absolutely forbidden from regulating drones in any way, right? So that's the playing field from which we started. And it is not codified that localities have the ability to say you may not launch drones from city-owned property, but every other property owner in America can say you can't launch drones from my property, so there isn't any reason why the localities would not have the same property right as anyone else. And so my colleagues and I have taken the position that we could say, no, you can't launch from a city park or in a city park. This is just one additional layer of complexity. If council was interested in allowing people to launch drones from, say, Waller Mill Park, then we would need to have some regulations in place about how that was done.
I can just see all these drone deliveries coming into the municipal building and we putting up a geofence saying, stay back. What about on the campaign finance reporting? When does that take effect? And it talks specifically candidates as opposed to people that are already in office.
Well, it took effect on July 1st. So someone who was a candidate that had to file something after July the 1st presumably would need to do that.
But it's not affecting current office holders?
No.
Okay, thank you.
It will be the next time you campaign.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any questions. Appreciate it.
I have one. Thank you very much for so succinctly clarifying on a lot of bills for us. I want to credit Councilmember Maslin on this question he had earlier. Are you tracking any bills that they are considering during the special session that may impact what we do in Williamsburg or other localities?
We're watching the special session, and I don't have anything in particular that I feel like I need to point out to you right now. But certainly when they go back, we're going to pay a lot of attention to what they're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Shelton. I don't have any questions either, but I look forward to hearing more when something needs to come forward. And I leave it with our council members that if there's something that you think needs some addressing and we want to bring up in the future, let's talk about it.
Mayor, also, I've made a list of about 17 different bills from the legislative report that either were close to or in line with goals or policies that the city council was interested in last year. And so we'll find a proper venue for us to discuss whether we're going to proceed with those.
Well, and then so also that kind of reminds me, we do our own legislative agenda.
Right.
And so as things come to mind that we want to bring up to potentially include on our legislative agenda in the future, let's make a note of that. We usually do that in
We'll start kicking that effort off in September.
September. Good. Thank you. Okay, that takes us to item number 5, City Council communication. Council have anything? None. Schedule of meetings. Talked about the meeting on Thursday and then again on the 14th. Those are coming up. So that takes us now to the open forum. If anybody would like to come forward. Seeing none, I know that we do have one letter that came in that I'm going to ask Mr. Trivett to just kind of paraphrase with the letter without reading the whole letter, but we're going to
Sure.
that letter for the record.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, during COVID-19 and our virtual meeting process, we had a vehicle for people to submit written comment and have it read into the record. It's not our standard procedure. And so as we begin to go into phase 3 and meet in person again, we will go back to somewhat of a standard process. And so while we did receive this letter from Mike Johnson, who lives at 107 Governor Berkeley Road here in the city, we're not going to read the whole thing for the record, as the mayor said. I'll give you the short version of it. You all received the copies in your emails and hopefully have had a chance to read it. Mr. Johnson is concerned with the amount of traffic that is traversing Governor Berkeley Road, both in volume and speed. And over the last 3 years, the staff has worked with Mr. Johnson to both study the problem and identify potential solutions. Potential solutions discussed included everything ranging from installing sidewalks to reduce the width and control the speed and volume that way, to closure of Governor Berkeley at the Richmond Road entrance point. One discussion that was had was the fact that if we were going to pursue any of those options, we might want to do a survey of the neighborhood to determine how much support there would be for the folks that live most close to Governor Berkeley. And we've not done that because we're still pursuing what option would be the best option in terms of managing the problem that exists. Although many of the studies have indicated that the problem is not as significant as it could be, given the width of the road. So what he is asking here is the city council direct the staff to do the survey. And so that's really the gist of the letter that we received. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. So that'll conclude our open forum. And so that, seeing that there's nothing else on the agenda, motion to adjourn.
Mayor, I move that City Council adjourn.
Second.
Malika, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent?
Aye.
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Adjourned.